At 8:42 a.m., Ethan Mitchell parked his car in the lot outside the Camden, South Carolina Municipal Courthouse. The sunlight was already streaming through the trees, casting long shadows across the pavement. He let out a deep breath, knowing he was cutting it close. As a seasoned federal prosecutor, he was accustomed to operating with precision and punctuality. But today had been one of those mornings. The case at hand was simple: a property tax error on his grandmother's house. The city had inexplicably raised the tax rate on the home, a house that was more than just a property to Ethan. It was the foundation of his childhood, the place where he had learned right from wrong. But instead of easing into a routine morning, Ethan's schedule had been derailed by an urgent call about a human trafficking case. The defense team had filed an emergency motion, requiring his immediate attention. By the time he was done with the paperwork, his morning had been completely thrown off. He had barely enough time to make it to the courthouse. His car's tires squealed as he turned into the parking lot, already feeling the weight of the day's stress on his shoulders. He glanced at his watch. It was 8:50 a.m., just 10 minutes before his case was scheduled. Ethan adjusted his tie and grabbed his briefcase. It was going to be a tight squeeze to make it inside and be ready, but he would manage. As he walked toward the courthouse doors, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his assistant. "The judge in Camden is known to be tough on latecomers. Be careful." Ethan sighed, slipping the phone back into his briefcase. He wasn't concerned. He had the evidence and knew the facts were on his side. Still, the message stuck with him as he entered the courthouse, the familiar smell of coffee and paper mixing in the air. The courtroom had the dull, worn feel of a place that had seen its share of minor disputes over the years. The beige walls were scratched from decades of use, and the chairs, though functional, were clearly worn from countless hours of hearings. But today there was a buzz in the air. Ethan could feel it, the quiet hum of unease and expectation as people shuffled in, clutching papers for parking tickets, small claims, and petty disputes. He checked his watch again, 8:55 a.m., only a few minutes left. He moved down the narrow hallway, glancing at the room numbers. His case was in courtroom 204. He finally reached the door and adjusted his tie. Inside, a handful of people were already seated. Ethan found a spot near the back, flipping through his case file one last time. He had been caught up in the stress of the morning, but now was the moment to focus. He had 10 minutes, just enough time to go over the details of his case before it was called. The door opened, and in walked Judge Thomas Bradford. Tall, with neatly combed silver hair and piercing blue eyes, he exuded authority as soon as he entered the room. The room immediately quieted. Judge Bradford was known for his stern demeanor and quick rulings. Ethan had heard about the judge's reputation, efficient but sometimes overly harsh, especially toward those who didn't show the respect the court demanded. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room stood in unison. Ethan stood, his posture straight, his eyes fixed on the judge as Bradford took his seat. The silence that followed was palpable, and Judge Bradford began calling cases with crisp, efficient commands. As Ethan settled into his seat, he couldn't help but notice a few people who were arriving late. An older man in a gray suit who slipped in and took a seat unnoticed, and a young woman who came in casually dressed, glancing at her phone before sitting down. Both arrived well after the session had started, yet neither of them seemed to attract the judge's attention. Ethan made a mental note but didn't think too much of it until his name was called at exactly 9:15 a.m. He stood walking to the front with his folder in hand. As he approached the podium, he could feel the shift in the room. All eyes were on him, and Judge Bradford's sharp gaze was fixed on him. "You're late, Mr. Mitchell," the judge said sharply, his voice cutting through the silence. "Do you think your time is more valuable than the court's?" Ethan stood tall, acknowledging the remark. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was dealing with urgent federal matters." Judge Bradford didn't let him finish. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, perhaps you should reconsider your priorities." Ethan remained calm, though inside he was beginning to feel the weight of the judge's harshness. This was more than just a late arrival. It was something deeper, something that was starting to feel very personal. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence after the judge's words. Ethan stood at the podium, feeling the eyes of the room on him. He could sense the weight of judgment, not just from Judge Bradford, but from everyone present. The $750 fine, delivered so swiftly, hung in the air like an accusation that would not be easily dismissed. The words "undermines the integrity of these proceedings" echoed in his mind as he tried to focus on the case at hand. But something about the moment didn't sit right. He glanced around, observing the room more carefully than he had before. To his surprise, the other latecomers, a middle-aged man in a worn gray suit and a young woman in casual clothes, were not given even a second glance by the judge. Both had arrived after the session started, just like Ethan. But unlike him, they weren't reprimanded. There had been no mention of fines, no stern rebukes. Ethan couldn't help but make a mental note of the discrepancy. He'd spent years in the legal system, trained to observe details, to read situations with a professional eye. And what he was seeing now, this disparity in how people were being treated based on their appearance, race, or possibly even class, struck him as not just an error, but a pattern. The judge continued with the proceedings, his tone detached and businesslike, moving on to the next case as if nothing significant had happened. But Ethan was no longer paying full attention to the motions. His mind was racing, his thoughts turning inward as he tried to process what had just transpired. Why had he been singled out? And why had the judge responded with such disproportionate severity? The fine, the reprimand, the sense of dismissal. It wasn't just about punctuality anymore. This felt personal. It felt unjust. And as Ethan sat back down, he realized that this wasn't just about one man's tardiness or the specific case in front of him. This was a symptom of something deeper, a larger issue that had somehow found its way into this courtroom. As the judge called the next case, Ethan opened his file, but his eyes were no longer on the property tax documents he had brought. Instead, he began jotting down notes quickly, his pen flying across the page as he documented every moment, every detail of what had happened. The disparity between his treatment and the others lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the thought that the same system that had been indifferent to the middle-aged man and young woman could easily be turned against others, especially people like him. He was no stranger to bias, to prejudice in the legal world, but this was different. It was too blatant to ignore. In the back row, Ethan could see a few others beginning to shift in their seats, their expressions revealing their discomfort. An elderly man, a longtime visitor of the courthouse, shifted his gaze nervously toward Ethan before quickly looking away. A court clerk, typing furiously, slowed her pace and hesitated before continuing. Even the bailiff, standing at attention, seemed to be taking longer glances than usual at the proceedings. The undercurrent of tension in the room was unmistakable. The silence that followed the fine felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just the weight of his own experience, it was the collective discomfort of the people around him, as though they were all aware, at least on some level, that something wasn't right. Ethan's mind was sharp, and his instincts told him that this wasn't a coincidence. The judge's response, the fine, the dismissal of the other latecomers. Everything pointed to something deeper, a bias in the system, a bias that, despite the court's image of fairness, was embedded deeply in how people were treated. He glanced up at Judge Bradford, who was still moving through cases with his usual mechanical efficiency. The judge didn't seem to notice, or perhaps didn't care, that the atmosphere in the room had shifted. He was too busy moving through the motions of the day, uninterested in the subtle but undeniable shift in power that had just taken place. But Ethan cared. He was no longer just fighting for his case or his reputation. He was fighting for something bigger now. The injustice he had just witnessed, experienced, was not something he could walk away from. The question that lingered in his mind was no longer just about the property tax case. It was about the system as a whole, the court system, and how deeply entrenched biases might be influencing decisions in ways most people never even saw. The next case was called. Ethan stood again, trying to push down the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. As he approached the podium, he felt a new sense of resolve forming inside him. This wouldn't be just about winning or losing a case. It would be about exposing the hidden biases that lurked beneath the surface of the system. It would be about holding the court accountable and, more importantly, challenging the status quo. As Ethan stepped up to the podium for his case, he felt a strange calmness settle over him. The gavel had already come down on him once that morning, but it hadn't shattered his composure. His mind was focused now, not just on the property tax issue, but on something deeper, something far more troubling. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice steady, "I have here the documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment on my grandmother's home. As you can see, the tax increase is inconsistent with the city's assessments for similar properties in the area. This was a mistake." Judge Bradford, who had barely looked up from his papers, glanced at the file for a moment, his cold blue eyes scanning the documents with little interest. Ethan continued, explaining the specifics of the case, the history of the property, the decades of stability with tax assessments, and the sudden, unexplained increase. But the judge's indifference was palpable. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if he were waiting for something, perhaps for Ethan to finish speaking so he could move on to the next case. "I'll review the materials in due time, Mr. Mitchell," the judge said dismissively, before adding, "However, your tardiness this morning remains a matter we cannot overlook." He raised an eyebrow, his gaze piercing. "Do you truly believe that the urgency of your federal responsibilities justifies disrespecting this court?" Ethan didn't flinch. His mind was clear now. The case wasn't the issue. The issue was the court's lack of fairness, and he wasn't about to let that slide. "Your Honor," Ethan replied, his voice calm yet firm, "I mean no disrespect. My delay was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter that required my immediate attention. I trust we can all agree that such cases demand urgent focus." Judge Bradford's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone didn't soften. "Your priorities, however noble, do not excuse breaking the rules. Court procedures exist for a reason. This is not about your case or your circumstances. This is about the integrity of this court." Ethan took a slow breath, allowing the words to settle. He knew he wasn't going to win this argument. It wasn't just about late arrivals or procedure anymore. It was about something deeper, something that Judge Bradford seemed unwilling to address. But Ethan wasn't about to back down. "Your Honor," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom?" There was a brief pause, a slight tension hanging in the air. Ethan glanced around the room, his gaze sweeping over the other defendants, the ones who had arrived late but hadn't been reprimanded. The man in the gray suit, the young woman with the phone, they all sat quietly, unscathed. No fines, no reprimands. The difference between them and him was glaring now, and he wasn't about to ignore it. The judge's face reddened and his grip on the gavel tightened. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court?" Bradford's voice was low but dangerous, as if daring Ethan to push further. "I'm asking for clarity," Ethan replied evenly. "It's important to ensure that fairness is upheld, not just for me, but for everyone who comes through this system." A ripple of unease passed through the room. The other defendants shifted in their seats, and the court clerk paused in her typing. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan could feel the weight of his words sinking in, and he could tell that the atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer just about a single case or a single man's tardiness. It was about the systemic issue that had been quietly festering under the surface. Judge Bradford's face hardened, and the air grew thick with tension. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he raised his gavel, preparing to end the discussion. "I will not tolerate accusations against this court," he said, his voice cold. "Your fine stands, Mr. Mitchell." Ethan bowed his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said quietly, returning to his seat. He knew that this wasn't the end of the matter. In fact, it felt like the beginning of something far bigger, something that couldn't be ignored any longer. As he sat back down, his mind was already working, analyzing the situation with the precision of a seasoned prosecutor. The fine was just a symptom, and the true issue ran much deeper. This court, this judge, had just shown him something he had already suspected for years. A system that wasn't as fair as it appeared. A system that was rife with bias, even if it wasn't always obvious. Ethan's pen moved across the page as he jotted down notes, cataloging his observations. The silence in the room had shifted again, now laden with an uncomfortable tension. The people around him, the other defendants, the court staff, They all felt it too. Something had changed, and Ethan knew without a doubt that he wasn't going to let it slide. Ethan left the courthouse that morning with more than just his briefcase in hand. He had his notebook, filled with the observations that had been running through his mind ever since Judge Bradford had imposed the fine. It was clear now, this was more than just an isolated incident. There was a deeper issue at play, and Ethan was determined to uncover it. Back at his office, Ethan's mind raced as he reviewed the events. He had been a prosecutor long enough to recognize when something wasn't right, when the system that was supposed to be impartial was instead tilted. What had happened that morning in the courtroom was too blatant to ignore, and it was something he had seen before, though never so starkly. He spent the next few hours compiling his notes and writing a report. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the evidence he had gathered in that single morning was undeniable. The disparity between how people were treated, the way some latecomers were ignored while others like him faced harsh penalties, was a red flag. He couldn't let it slide. By the end of the day, he had sent the report to his supervisor, Angela Hayes, at the U.S. Attorney's Office. His stomach churned as he hit send. He had seen cases of bias before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about his case or his fine. This was about the integrity of the court system itself. The next morning, his phone buzzed. Angela was calling. "Ethan, I read your report," she said, her voice urgent. "This is disturbing. If what you're describing is accurate, it's not just an isolated situation. This could indicate systemic bias. It's bigger than just your case. This could go all the way to the top." Ethan exhaled sharply, feeling a sense of both relief and dread. "I think it is systemic," he replied. "It's not just the fine, Angela. It's the way the judge treated me versus everyone else. There's something deeper going on here." Angela paused. "I'll reach out to the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be handled delicately, but thoroughly. In the meantime, gather as much documentation as you can. If this goes public, we need to be ready." The conversation ended, but Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. The tension that had been building in the courtroom that morning wasn't just a product of his late arrival. It was part of a much larger problem. And if he had any hope of making a difference, he needed more evidence. Over the next few weeks, Ethan dug deeper. He reached out to colleagues who had worked in Camden's court system, speaking to attorneys who had appeared before Judge Bradford. The responses were overwhelming, and they confirmed his suspicions. Stories of unequal treatment flooded in. Stories of black defendants being fined disproportionately for minor infractions, while white defendants received leniency or warnings. Ethan's phone rang constantly, often with anonymous tips from people who had worked in the courthouse. They shared their stories of witnessing biases in sentencing, in judgments, and in how cases were handled. There was a clear pattern, one that was impossible to ignore. The investigation picked up momentum as local news outlets caught wind of the story. A journalist from the Camden Herald reached out to Ethan for an interview, eager to report on the investigation. The story began to take shape as public outrage mounted. People who had been affected by the court's actions started to come forward, sharing their experiences in the media. "I was fined $500 for a parking violation," one woman told the reporter. "I don't know why. I've seen other people in that courtroom, white people, get away with it. They didn't even get a fine." Another man who had been a defendant in Bradford's courtroom years earlier described how the judge had interrupted him multiple times during his testimony, but let a white defendant finish without interruption just minutes later. The media coverage intensified, and soon it wasn't just Camden that was watching, it was the entire state. The Judicial Review Commission, which had initially planned a quiet inquiry, now found itself under public pressure to act quickly. Investigators began arriving at the courthouse to review case records, interview staff, and gather testimony from anyone willing to speak out. Among those who came forward was Martha Reed, the longtime court clerk. She had worked under Judge Bradford for years and had kept a private notebook detailing instances of what she believed were unfair decisions. "These are my personal notes," she said nervously when the investigator spoke to her. "I've been writing them down because I've been too afraid to speak up before, but I can't stay silent anymore." Her notebook contained detailed accounts of how black defendants had been treated differently from white defendants. Her records, combined with testimony from bailiffs and other courthouse staff, painted a damning picture. It was clear now that this wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a pattern of bias that had been ingrained in Camden's court system for years. The mounting evidence left little room for doubt, and with every new piece of information that surfaced, the story gained more traction. Ethan knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he couldn't back down. This was bigger than any individual case. This was about exposing the hidden bias that had been embedded in the system for far too long. The pressure on Camden's judicial system continued to grow as the investigation into Judge Bradford's conduct gained national attention. Local activists, outraged by the reports of systemic bias in the courtroom, organized rallies and protests outside the courthouse, signs reading, "Justice should be blind and end." Bias now became regular fixtures in the area as the public rallied for accountability. Ethan watched as the story, once a quiet complaint from a single late arrival, turned into a national movement. Headlines across the country echoed the same message: systemic bias uncovered in Camden courtroom. For Ethan, this was both a victory and a reminder of how deep the problem ran. He had started this journey as a simple prosecutor, but now he was at the center of something much larger. By the time the Judicial Review Commission completed its inquiry, the evidence was overwhelming. The commission's report highlighted a staggering pattern of racial disparity in how fines were levied and how cases were handled in Judge Bradford's courtroom. Black defendants had consistently received harsher fines and sentences for minor infractions, while white defendants were often given leniency. Even more damning were the testimonies from court staff, like Martha Reed, who had recorded years of questionable decisions in her personal notes. With mounting evidence, the State Judicial Board called for immediate reforms. They ordered mandatory bias training for all judges in Camden, along with regular audits of case outcomes to ensure fairness and equality. The changes were swift, but Judge Bradford, unable to escape the mounting pressure, announced his resignation. His statement was brief: "I believe it is in the best interest of this court and this community that I step aside." The reactions were mixed. Some saw it as an admission of guilt, while others viewed it as a necessary step toward healing. For Ethan, it was a bittersweet victory. He had pushed the system to confront its flaws, but the work didn't end there. The courthouse was quieter now, and the signs of reform were evident. The newly appointed judge, a younger figure with a reputation for fairness and impartiality, had already begun to implement the necessary changes. The once overlooked issues of racial bias and inequality were now at the forefront of the courtroom. Ethan didn't seek the spotlight, but he couldn't ignore the impact his actions had on others. He was invited to speak at law schools and community forums, sharing his story and advocating for the importance of challenging systemic biases. His work inspired a new generation of legal professionals, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, who saw in his actions a blueprint for how to fight for justice, not just in the courtroom, but in the world. At one such event, a young Black law student approached him after his speech, her eyes wide with admiration. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules," she said. "It's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride and responsibility. Despite the progress, Ethan knew the work wasn't done. The changes in Camden were just the beginning. The ripples of the investigation reached far beyond the city limits. Other communities, inspired by the reforms in Camden, began re-evaluating their own court systems. The state implemented broader judicial reforms, conducting audits of case outcomes with particular attention to racial and socioeconomic disparities. As the years passed, Ethan's office became a hub for young lawyers who wanted to make a difference. They came to him for advice, mentorship, and guidance, inspired by the work he had done. In a small but meaningful way, Ethan knew that the fight for justice was slowly but surely changing the system. And in the courthouse where it all began, a small plaque was installed near the entrance. It read, "Equal justice is everyone's right." It was a simple reminder that the work of ensuring justice was never finished, but always worth fighting for.